Greetings, gentle readers, fellow earthlings. Today, from a study with Ross Finlayson, is Logos 2000, 21st Century Foundations. This is the approximately 52nd installment of Logos 2000 and will be the conclusion of this series. The topic and subject today is A theory. A theory. A is usually understood as the indefinite article, an instance, a representative. A is also the first letter of the alphabet, indicating in language the beginning. A theory is the idea that a theory is kind of any old idea at all, but even pronouncing of the long A as A theory indicates a different form of emphasis on the theory, A theory. That is regards to logos and the discurso logos, and that being about the discourse and logic and for reason, de res, de ratio, de natura, de re, the reason, the rationality, the natural and the real, is as about for then the approfondissement, the foundations. So the idea is that there's a 21st century theory of foundations, and that it's a theory, because nothing else is a theory, with regards to that being the requirements and desiderata overall of a theory. The theory, then, is of after axiomless natural deduction. And so today I'll be mentioning Hegel quite often. As with regards to Hegel, and then that being kind of before the 20th century and kind of the culmination of German idealism and the beginning of the later adopters of various forms of Hegelianism as very authoritative. These matters of reason. It's for the Aristotelians that after being Aristotelian, then there's the Hegelian. Say. So, in matters of philosophy and reason, and then as for rhetoric, Hegel is very strong. And why it's being addressed here more of the metaphysical questions aspects, the fundamental question of metaphysics, is that after Kant sets up being, and we can point back to the Aristotelian, for example, with regards to substances and substance and being and essences and substances. Being, and later its perceived importance or relevance or centrality in the works of Heidegger, for example, has that Hegel picks up being and nothing. And so with regards to axiomless natural deduction, that's sort of nothing, sort of starting from nothing. And so it's readily arrived at that it doesn't say anything. Yet then when that's all there is to it and all there can be, because any kind of axiomatization is a stipulation, so it's unfounded by itself eventually. And this is known since the ancient Greeks, that any old theory can be put down as any old theory by any other. The idea of a theory that thusly stands for itself is this idea of axiomless natural deduction, then to arrive at axiomless geometry. So that then Euclid's arises in his whole, and then as well for the super-Euclidean, about the points in infinity and the parallel postulate, and about the point at zero and the double angle, that a straight line is two angles. These being aspects of deconstructive accounts of Euclidean geometry and super-Euclidean geometry. Instead of non-Euclidean geometry or non-classical or non-standard, it's super-Euclidean and super-classical and super-standard is the ideas. Because otherwise a usual valid sound kind of non-standard account still leaves itself at odds with a standard account. So putting them together is to be making for that they are together the extraordinary. So A theory, as I've called it, since 25 years ago or so, is after the principle inverse, and then this sufficient and thorough reason. These principles, why A theory is the candidate for foundations. And according kind of to definition and what's left over of it, and the universals in particulars of being and nothing, it's the only one there can be. And so it's given this name as A theory, is for the null axiom theory, none, or the universal axiom theory, all. Those being kind of the same thing, either way, put together when the elements in the universe are everything that they are not. They're defined this way, as you can kind of read or listen from these conversations. That A theory is thusly sort of laid out in this sort of account. So Hegel gives this in the Wissenschaft der Logik, or logic over here, the Wissenschaft der Logik, the science of logic. And so one of the sections he has is about the being and nothing, and then how that arrives. And he basically sets them at either side and establishes that they're both as like to so, and that nothing or nichte or ninte are these various terms that in today existentialism and nihilism talk about being and nothing, that these are one for each other, and underneath that as they're conflated and prototypical and architectonic, that they both reflect on each other as they're indistinguishable, but it doesn't matter because either suffices to stand in for the other. So, thusly in this manner, it helps resolve these considerations of the knackabout, and for the principle of inversion and the principle of sufficient and thorough reason, that is justified, that it's okay, and that thusly, given that geometry can arrive from it, and also matters of logic, the modal logic and the Boolean logic, quite directly from the consideration of these surrounds, and then given that there's something from nothing at all, generating a whole Comenius language full of all the truisms, the end of which is this one liar paradox, which ends up not being a paradox because it's just a last completion that makes it so that then anything else in a later kind of Coleridge language can be compared to it to find where something is contradictory or paradoxical, to determine that out as part of the logic for deduction here, that then this sort of abduction makes for this deduction, and then also that it grounds the inductive account, its regularity, but according to the deduction has this greater reality and regularity, this more full and wide, this wider and fuller dialectic. Hegel's dialectic is introduced usually in the form of the essay, and the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, presenting a status quo consideration, and then a something that reflects on why it is to change, and the synthesis of bringing them together as a thing, a persuasive sort of form. But the dialectic is the reading twice to find also, for example, that there's always all the different counts. Aristotle always reads every syllogism in every order, won't be made a fool, and knows which orders lead to something in the land of tertium non datur is so, and which ones in the land of tertium non datur are not, or the ones that aren't there in this tertium non datur, the world with no third ground. The third does not exist. That thusly, this sort of following is after the principle of inversion and principle of sufficient and thorough reason is a theory. And it's a good theory. It says something. It says everything that's logical. It says everything that's geometrical. Then that we can consider that exists like to so, and then get into this account more thoroughly of the mathematics. So saying that it's principled, that it has principles, how is that any different than axioms? So axioms are stipulations, and principles are ideals. And either way, one could say that they're not different at all. That there's a law or an axiom or a principle to be so followed that is so. So why the principle of inversion and the principle of sufficient and thorough reason aren't axioms for this axiomless natural deduction. And you can find references to this axiomless natural deduction in the literature. Here that it's kind of presented as, after Hegel and for these sorts of accounts and the fundamental question of metaphysics and these kinds of things. That principles reflect upon the multiplicities that inversion brings. For example, it's a principle of itself, its own principle, so that it's actually just an aspect of this knockabout or turning things over in the mind, or as they would, being that they can never be actually realized, they have this asymptotic freedom when finally reaching to a thing, it may have changed, that when it's so that it is just universal and null at the same time, that these dually self-infraconsistent elements, prototypical, architectonic, make for this kind of paraconsistent dialectic. True wisdom as after the readings and discovery and about them and that they're coming together, this whole of this thing to bring to, so then when Hegel has being and then to introduce nothing, because the entire conversation can only bring being and which is itself kind of underdefined, and then nothing being all left out, and then bringing them together, that he sets them apart and then puts them in contradistinction. And so then from this he also addresses the fundamental question of metaphysics as to why nothing is a thing. And so that's one of the great takeaways from Hegel's Wissenschaft der Logik, and it's held up for him here as kind of stating that. Then here it's this dually self-infraconsistent, and the universe and everything is not, and that being nothing or the universe, either way, those being the same thing for each other, with us just being finite creatures in the middle, the mesoscale of these things, the microcosm and the macrocosm, or the macrocosm as the on high and us as the microcosm in an individual. That here then other touchstones of that include Duns Scotus for the infinite, the actual infinite, and various ideas, for example, about Husserl and for Derrida, that the Lebenswelt and the geometry and the proto-geometric, for these considered the greatest and most cited of 20th century philosophers, among Derrida and Husserl and Heidegger and Sartre. That what I plan to do today was introduce this so briefly that the A theory then you could consider, from my opinion, that then from that I have stood up making for a good theory that holds good all of geometry, and then all for number theory, arithmetic, algebra, and analysis so follow, function theory and topology are where these aspects of the superclassical and superstandard after the extraordinary come in, since the extraordinary is up front and infinity is in throughout the theory, because it has to be. It's run out from itself that these universals and the null make for this. That the A theory thus is strong. And then it makes for the account, as from these other kind of 50 lectures or so, the teleology, not to be confused with theology, although they share a common image, the teleology, the purpose of the nature of things, and the ontology, the great science, and all its data, all its theories, are as to so follow from at least one theory is true. So truth is the primary quantity in this theory. Then it gets into the logical and what's true and untrue, for the affirmatory and negatory and these kinds of things. Then what I'm looking at today is to get some inspirations from Hegel a bit. Gadamer, a student of Heidegger, who ends kind of with Amicus Plato, kind of for the Platonic ideals and Hermeticism and hermeneutics, in a sense, but for the hermeneutical, as his account of the language and the being, and then for a bit of from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a 20th century philosopher and who I haven't read too much, but is famous. Perhaps among some readers, most famous for one time the internet meme of Sartre's cookbook, where it was a satirical or parodical yet affectionate account of the consideration of the issues of nihilism and with regards to existentialism and the account of Sartre as after Nietzsche and on his own account sort of a saner version of Nietzsche. Then there's to be some consideration of Sartre as after being and nothing, finding that unfounded, Hegel's account and Heidegger's account, that instead of for like Hegel and the being and nothing and becoming, that's also a thing, and for Heidegger and the being and nothing, and then his absent vacation in a sense, and then or setting them at attention to each other, attention, not attention, but Heidegger's account of being and nothing, or Sein and Das, usually more so it's Sein and Dasein, being in itself, with regards to Kant and the thing in itself, the Ding an sich. These cases for the German idealistic tradition, which all includes pretty much all of the Greek idealistic tradition, which and analytic tradition, which has been carried through all of since history and is recording these matters of these things. What's considered and deemed part of this A theory is to kind of bootstrap the axiomless natural deduction for this fundamental question of metaphysics with regards to the dually self-infraconsistent that it may be. And then for this Comenius language and Coleridge language, that thusly Hegel and Heidegger and Derrida and Husserl, and then Sartre after that, where Sartre also reads Husserl. That gets to like the later middle part of the 20th century, and then Gadamer kind of caps off his tradition as of Amicus Plato. We trust Plato. It's Platonistic. There are ideals. It's the idealistic tradition. And then for the analytic tradition and these incredible efforts to bridge them together, yeah, especially when at the ends they don't. The inductive accounts and the inductive impasse guarantees this chasm between otherwise the idealistic and analytic tradition, that this A theory arrives at combined idealistic, the teleological, and analytical, the ontological tradition, as the only possible putative candidate for foundations. Logic and mathematics, then physics and science. So, with that said, where I got this from is, well, I'd read some Hegel at least in my college years, or as a young man, and then studied foundations really for continuity and infinity, because later then, of course, there's the entire account of modern mathematics, and today it's usually, or it is, Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory, and then descriptive set theory with least upper bound and measure 1.0 being defined and axiomatized to give a descriptive account of Cauchy-Weierstrass, and delta epsilon x, the field reals, these other continuous domains of line reals and signal reals, that with regards to that aspect of mathematics, that's kind of what I studied first to get into this, was continuity, and then infinity, the standard potential infinity, it's just unboundedness. We all know this from our classes in calculus and being described after Zeno's thought experiments, but that this is a way we can say it is at least close enough to be so. That later the deductive account demands a greater rigor to make it so and actual. And then with regards to standard, non-standard, as if there were any standard at all models of arithmetic and integers, that modern mathematics is later, but it has to have something to sit on like this, that eventually it has nothing to sit on, and then it's just for reason in the object sense to make for that, yes, even phenomenologically, our object sense makes and keeps this so. So this is the best theory I could figure out, and it's perfect as far as I can tell, because it's not imperfect. And so anything else that doesn't have these aspects of like the phenomenological and the ontological from one side, or the idealistic and the absolute from the other side. This is an example within then this theory of all the words about all the theories, the land of imagination in theory. As for the notion of consciousness, that it as Sartre, for example, begins to describe, or is described by the introduction to Sartre as being a nothingness in the translation, that consciousness both sees outside and can't really see everything, and sees inside and can't really see everything. But both is of a strong account in view. So let's see what may be found from these books. So I haven't got much into Sartre yet. As you can see, the bulk of it is a bit unread yet. But the translator, Hazel E. Barnes, is a great translator to English from University of Colorado, and so describes that there's being and nothingness, and as kind of as I've relayed here, is after Hegel's and Heidegger's account for Husserl, the aspect of Sartre. And then there's also with regards to Sartre and his Nietzschean. So Sartre addresses Hegel, and then Sartre addresses Nietzsche. And he's not really satisfied with either of them, but he does come up with it. His conscience is there, and that he does have a setting, an appreciation of something greater, or Kant's sublime. So that's just said is to relate that as after a deconstructive account, in the constructive account of Sartre, or for example, after the Carnap and Quine's, etc.'s Vienna Circle, that being way after like Comte or logicist positivism, that being way after Occam and nominalism and fictionalism. These ideas being is like, well, we can never have really a theory, so we're just saying names, but they're close. And we will ignore that they aren't distant, and then in fact say that they're invincible. That being subject to his own account. Another one that just says no. So, and where the idea is the inversion is just like you can turn it over, it turns over every which way. It does. So it's fine. And it's got to be that way. So that these accounts then, after the idealistic tradition, because so much of the baggage was attached to deistic dogma, and then there was a great rejection that Sartre, for example, is given as an atheist. In fact, he takes a very strong stand in position of the defense of atheism, or to the extent he says there is no deity, largely because he felt that it would be unattainable. That doesn't necessarily have to conflict with otherwise, and much of, as the translator notes, Derrida's consideration is the weighing the arguments of that, and then just saying, well, there must be this great sort of authority, and anybody who tells me how it's supposed to be is fundamentally unjustified. So for the Sartre's comment, or with regards to there is no God, a little bit stronger than Nietzsche's God is dead, it's still to be given and shown that that's because they're confronting the great void of the nihilism so introduced, and putting that into their conscience, giving themselves rational justifications in the form of Sartre, and a sort of an outcry from Nietzsche. Why then that thusly restoring the briefest, merest ideological tradition suffices, while not overpowering what would otherwise be the great analytical and ontological tradition, and its results and its strengths, so that this way a theory can have neither a weak logicist positivism but a strong one, nor a weak or missing or absent idealism yet a strong one. And that's not merely the way it should be, the requirements and desiderata of a theory. It is so. It must sign. So that kind of it reflects on then that one thing that was mentioned in this that I wanted to mention about Sartre was he says, or the translator Hazel says about Sartre's book, because he titled it this other book about phenomenology and the great ontology. So this logicist positivism, sometimes you'll see something that says like, well, that's not what we say anymore in our empirical pragmatism, our correspondent, coherent, and pragmatist theories of truth. But it's exactly what it is. Don't let anybody tell you different, because that's just like saying, well, it had too many objections, and so we're just going to absent ourselves by wrapping the old as new, except cutting off the labels and hiding where it comes from. That the ideological tradition and the analytical tradition are very thorough and recurring, and for intuitionists and constructivists, the same for all these times and for all these times. Then that for matters of other persuasion and sophistication, for example, about Plato's category, the other, as described in the Sophist, that the Sophists and Epicureans are divorced from otherwise the fuller context than just saying that that's a justification for reason rationality, like Marxism or something like that. Or otherwise these neo-Hegelians or various flavors, derivative and adulterated from Hegelianism, that everyone has to be their own Hegelian. And then finding it and understanding and getting through the phases of mental and philosophical maturity and development, or finding one that's good and staying there, or finding one where one can cope and being there, and these kinds of things. That Sartre then thusly maybe read as in his time for the zeitgeist and then for the surrounds as saying something, as the translator Barnes puts it, as part of a comprehensive philosophy and for saying something. And here that what he says is that even if Hegel and his being and nothing together is not good, and even if Heidegger trying to make it better makes it worse is not good, I have existentialism and nihilism, and it's thorough, and so it's going to be justified. And besides the fact that people take all the different aspects of fragments of that as one way or the other as being just entirely not a coherent thing. Temporalizing. This is that we live in a modal, temporal, relevant logic, that everything that's reality is somehow true. Of course, everyone's phenomenology and perceptions are different. That's about the intersubjectivity and interobjectivity. That's fine. It's going to be okay. And it is so that thus there are limits in terms of our means and our methods. Yet the idea that Hegel or Sartre has as like otherism, and like the main point of Sartre being that it's like my conscience can't be within me, like Descartes says, cogito ergo sum, because it would be having needfully being external, and but at the same time he puts down the modern psychology of the day, like Freud and Jung, and that is saying is like also it's not my id or ego. Those are just not it. That's the animal, insensate, unconscious part of me. My conscious is outside of that. If I'm looking in, I have to look. If I'm in, I have to look out. If I'm out, I have to look in. Kind of like then for Janus's, the ancient Greek gods with two faces or whatever, his introspection is like he's seeing both ways at once. Yet can he really think about it? His introspection. That this is for why Sartre sets up the inductive impasses out of the way, and he needs this wider, fuller dialectic then to arrive at resolution of consciousness. Simultaneity, therefore, does not belong to the existence of the world. It supposes the co-presence to the world of two presents considered as presences to. So this is under the existence of others, setting up for himself a personal objectivism. And then is something like the transcendental personal objectivism that came up. It has that Sartre has one for Husserl that he thinks is a nice place. did not realize any mit sign, the with being. So in all these different compound words and trying to make the reflections like as of the Atman or Brahman and perspective and projection, the metaphor to work through the development, that it builds and is monotonic and that entails the development. That is the thing. Then he gets into here freedom and facticity. And for example, he confronts freedom as putting down Heidegger's version of freedom, and that here it's kind of abstract and arbitrary, and maybe even capricious. What freedom is, that it exists because it's unfalsifiable to say it doesn't. So much like deity is freedom. And indeed, that's often what times people will put to it is that, well, then, according to Nietzsche, will to power and this kind of stuff, which Sartre puts down, and not necessarily just because he was put in a German prison or war camp for a year after World War II started, and then after that he joined the French Resistance, as the translator notes, because that was used by soi-disant, so to say, in Francais, Hegelians to say that they're Nietzscheans, to say that they're Heideggerian or whatever, that's not necessary for Sartre to have his own freedom of will. And then furthermore, he won't let anybody else say that theirs is of a higher order. So Aristotle won't be fooled, and Sartre won't be moved. He describes reference to the a posteriori after the ontological, so he could be a thorough or Aristotelian, and then gets into the difference between action and the for the gerund and the infinitive in language. That the infinitive, when you think about it, it's like, why do they call it an infinitive? It really kind of is. Digging to dig a digging to dig a digging to dig a digging. It's an infinite to say to, and then the gerund, it comes around is carrying it forward. So to dig carries out all these different ways. So it's kind of the knockbat, and the knockbat is the idea. The infinitive, the gerund, the verb, then with regards to the copula, just what is, these kinds of things. That's kind of my impression of Sartre after having been studying this. But then I did want to find at some point some way to address this, because otherwise just picking up Sartre by itself, it would just be a treatise on existentialism, nihilism, which wouldn't be very satisfying. Keys to special terminology. Absurd, that which is meaningless. So here as we talk about the absurd is both where the meaninglessness begins and where it ends. So it's kind of absurd to consider the absurd, yet it is absurd, which are forms. So the zerds are forms and not meaningless. So it's out of those. It's like, well, that's like saying, well, out of Plato's ideals, which we don't really know, but on the other side, it's coming out of those somehow, but I don't get it. Compared to that, it's silly, is the other idea here. So the absurd isn't necessarily silly. And here it's framed as that there's the ad absurdum, which is like, it doesn't come back from the absurd, and ad infinitum, which goes all the way to the forms. Those being otherwise the same in many usual matters of quantification. Anguish, the reflective apprehension of the self as freedom, realization that a nothingness slips in between myself and my past, Sartre's, and future, so that nothing relieves me from the necessity of continually choosing myself, and for nothing guarantees the validity of the values which I choose. Fears of something in the world, anguish is anguish before myself, as in Kierkegaard. So it's said that Sartre kind of rejects Kierkegaard, and then he refers to him. And here is with regards to this kind of his definition and what it's to mean with regards to his having to kind of turn away from himself, is that because he can't admit that he can be in two places at once, in kind of a sense. Has that still our mental apparatus can arrive for each other. We can assure each other that that two Sartres theoretically could live for each other, and it would be okay. Being for others, the third ecstasis, as the translator notes, he waxes on the ecstasies, and then with regards to that in the Trinity, but he frames them as neutral in a sense. The third ecstasis of the for itself, there arises here a new dimension of being in which myself exists outside as an object for others. For others involves a perpetual conflict as each for itself seeks to recover its own being by directly or indirectly making an object out of the other. So this is that after objectivism, that one imagines that it's possible, though, that besides that he chooses to defend things like facticity and for example, as you know, the facticity of freedom is the fact that freedom is not able not to be free. Finitude, to be carefully distinguished from mortality. Finitude refers not to the fact that man dies, but the fact that it's a free choice of his own project of being. He makes himself finite by excluding other possibilities each time that he chooses the one which he prefers. Man would thus, because of his factivity, be finite even if immortal. Also that finitude usually reflects on that there is the infinite, and that it's not attainable in the potential, but somehow only in the actual. Future, historicize. Metaphysics, the study of individual processes which have given birth to this world, or the Lebenswelt of Husserl, as a concrete and particular totality. Metaphysics is thus concerned with the problem of why concrete existence are as they are. Sartre says that metaphysics is to ontology as history is to sociology. So this would be the translator's keys to terminology. Nihilate, a word coined by Sartre. Consciousness exists as consciousness by making a nothingness arise between it and the object of which it is consciousness. Thus, annihilation is that by which consciousness exists. To annihilate is to encase with a shell of non-being. The English word annihilate was first used by Helmut Kuhn in his encounter with nothingness. So that perhaps is the way to make a strong point about what Sartre says, is that the usual idea of experience is that there's a connection and a being with it. But Sartre says, well, no, the only way to have that is that there's some nothingness that allows you to distinguish and differentiate between that, to make a discontinuity between otherwise the continuity of things. So it's for matters of continuity and discontinuity, like, for example, from the T.E. Holm and his theory of art and his notions of these three kinds of Platonic and realistic and mental continuity, helping establish why the realm is in the mental for Sartre's consciousness. So that thusly, that nihilism for him is as well, since he finds it everywhere, then he puts it in a place where it makes sense. Noesis, Husserl's term for the intentional direction by consciousness toward an object external to it, the intending act as such with all its essential features. So being and nothing is a regular thing. An ontology, and let's see if there's mentioned teleology here in this key. Space, the nothingness of a relation apprehended as relation by the being which is his own relation. This gets into the ideas of the context, and as was mentioned, it's natural and it's kind of fundamental. Space is primarily subjective because of the result of the for itself's act of organizing relations between external objects, always in the light of the for itself's own ends. So here there's one that is objective, it's reality. And we're realists, and all this theory is technical, techno-analytic, both for the idealist and analytical tradition, because logically our realism would demand it because our minds say so. And there's nothing else that can possibly be, because that's all that's left after there's nothing in being together. The null and universal. This space is then, as from these different matters of perspective, and like from the reading from the Bible about, in the beginning there was space, or in the beginning there was the Word. Sartre's consciousness is much more about in the beginning that there was the Word and consciousness, vis-a-vis in the beginning there was much more the space and geometry and these kinds of things. Transphenomenality refers to the fact that being, although coextensive with its appearance, is not limited to it, that being surpasses the knowledge which we have of it and provides a basis for such knowledge. So we could kind of call it transphenomenality, but there's a good word for, or a phrase for the transcendence that Sartre describes, that as for transcendence, often refers simply to the process whereby the for itself goes beyond the given in a further project of itself. Projection, a project. Sometimes the for itself is itself called a transcendence, ... The word transcendence is sometimes purely a substantive, sometimes refers to a process. So it just means above and throughout and fully and thoroughly and the sublime for Kant and Kant's sublime. Let's see if there's something I wanted to see if I could find. This was the comment about his title of the phenomenology, just showing that he's a very strong logicist positivist for his existentialism and nihilism. And a phenomenological essay on ontology. And then the other idea is with regards to the transcendental and the consciousness that was mentioned was also that the introduction to this book is much like Derrida's introduction to Husserl, except where Husserl was saying for the transcendent there's got to be geometry, and Derrida was kind of tearing that down, is that Sartre has already thoroughly torn all that quite down, and then Barnes, the translator, puts it back up a bit. All right, then. So that being pretty much the beginning and end of what I'll say about Sartre, it's that for then, that's another giant in the 20th century. Yet Hegel is really kind of our biggest giant we have, as after Aristotle. And then for if I'm a realist and I'm an American from the 20th and 21st century, then it's as this A theory has it, that there's a revival and a revisitation and a revitalization of these themes and as throughout. And so it's generally almost entirely references to the canon and dogma, and then putting them in order, and then just outlining the development as it's come and gone, and then how it all arrives together. Or Amicus Plato. Reason in the Age of Science. So this is Hans-Georg Gadamer, Reason in the Age of Science. And he gets in a bunch of stuff about being and fire. One of his favorite concepts is fire, which is usually change, but it's to reflect on his ideas about the spirit, soul, and the spirit, stuff like that. So Heidegger, kind of like, or Gadamer, kind of like Heidegger, is a great reader of Plato, and particularly the pre-Socratic Greeks like Heraclitus and Parmenides with dual monism. Except that he makes kind of a dual monism and just makes it all dual and tears it apart instead of putting it back together. The deconstructive, then the reconstructive account, because we're structuralists, not disfigurists in the postmodern sense. To be modern, thoroughly. That Gadamer then here has something to say. Let's see if we can find it. Hegel's philosophy and its after effects until today. The heritage of Hegel. Hermeneutics is practical philosophy. Hermeneutics is a theoretical and practical task on the natural inclination of human beings toward philosophy. And then he says finally, philosophy or theory of science. So here it's both. So then what I figured to look at for a moment is Hegel's philosophy and its after effects until today. Or the hermeneutics is practical philosophy. Because then getting into the hermeneutics is like, well, I'm going to keep my philosophy even in the world of science. But the heritage of Hegel and Hegel's philosophy and its after effects till today might be relevant. And you can get a copy of this book somewhere. A book in the series Studies in Contemporary German Social Thought. The MIT Press, Cambridge. So there's a translator's introduction and it talks about Gadamer and Hegel. So this is translated by Frederick G. Lawrence. That these essays of Gadamer as a leading continental philosopher after Heidegger, says Dahlmeier out of Notre Dame. I know of no other short work by Gadamer that offers a more succinct yet brilliant demonstration of the contemporary importance of Gadamer's philosophy. Giddens, King's College. That Hegel's philosophy and its after effects until today, since this A theory basically is taking all that and rehabilitating it and revitalizing it, what's good, and giving it the pieces so that there's geometry and logic and mathematics on their own sake, and then as science, everything else is also well founded. Hegel's philosophy and its after effects until today. So he talks about as if introducing a lecturer to lecturers. Talks about Goethe, who is kind of a novelist, but he's kind of like Coleridge. We'll relate Goethe to Coleridge. Talking about phenomenology of the spirit on Hegel. Goethe, to whom Hegel had naturally sent his book, had taken offense at a particular passage. So clearly he had started reading the book, but evidently he did not get past that first page. Completely shocked, he knew that Hegel had written something completely repugnant to him. The bud disappears with the blooming of the blossom, and one could say that the former gets contradicted by the latter. So this is creation and destruction, conservation. Goethe, that convinced opponent of all revolutionary explosive theories in natural as well as human history, had, as is well known, treated the mystery of the organic growth of things precisely as exemplar for the correct mental stance of human beings as well. Hence his repudiation of the Hegelian text. Now, when one reads over that passage, one notices that if Goethe had turned the page, he would have found the passage preceding, quite in this sense, with a but that goes on to make good the organic unity. So here's this mention, because of our modal temporal relevance logic, that's true. There's no but, only yet. Because there's not contradiction that can never really be the case, there's just coincidence. And so then otherwise, that's just the thing. So he didn't read the entire manual. So that just goes to show that for people who might reject these sorts of accounts, they might just, it's not so much that something was taken out of context, it was not put in the context. The context might not be available. Yet the idea is that even that applies in the reductio and the double reductio and the reductio ad infinitum instead of ad absurdum to the theory being like so at all, a theory, axiomless, that again just constantly finds itself self-satisfying and satisfying to others is the idea. I get it. Modern empirical science found its first basis in the 17th century, the mechanics of Galileo and Huygens. As discussed in Moment in Motion, for example, for the Miltonian school, for everything, going back to Lucretius and matters of measure. I mean, going back to the rope stretchers or the surveyors of ancient Egypt. That's part of science. For that, it's repeatable. But yeah, the data and the industrial era brought the data was the thing. Hegel was the very last to dare to defend in his thinking the proud claim of philosophy to be the framework and comprehensive totality for all possible human knowing. Oh, I dispute that. I mean, that is to say, there are other theorists in all these philosophers after this are Hegelian too. So Hegel though is a giant and he's held up as a landmark and real great. Hegel attempted a final synthesis of nature and history. See, here it's limited to the technical and techno-analytical account. And then there's relation of phenomenology and thinking beings, their object sense, which may so find in accords a sort of theoretical account. Compared to like Kant on love or beauty or these things, or absolute morals and ethics. Those are discussed here. But it's just to be stated that this theory of everything, a theory, a putative theory candidate for foundations, is that we are yet limited, finite creatures. And so the foundations here is just about getting at least one good geometry and continuity and infinity. And then having for that being true and sound, then all the rest of physics can arrive, given a strong sort of mathematical universe hypothesis, and that then otherwise these matters of the human condition are their own matters of the human condition. Then with that establishing a clock hypothesis and thus the notion of temporality and modality, those being strong, then yeah, everything kind of fits on that. This great lattice of the hypercube of the infinite dimensional space. Yeah, sure it does, but how it does that is underdefined. as regards to continuity and Poincaré completion, and why there are three space dimensions, an array of time in our real physical universe, and how that is so. It's talking about consciousness. So this is Gadamer. So the Gadamer's approach is to translate that this is his theory of being and ontology, and then he doesn't really say much about nothing. He just talks about the logos of being. Naturally, because it was the last peak on the summit of the most ancient claim, of the Greek claim of thinking through the logos of being, it lost its popularity quite rapidly. Hegel has always been famous as far as I know. Hegel has remained a suspect figure in the intellectual world internationally, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries. Today, a counter-movement is emerging for the first time. There are now, even in England and America, new Hegel societies that turn their attention again to this last thinker capable of comprehending with his philosophic genius our knowledge and our sense of the world. But all in all, we have to say, today Hegel still remains suspect in the view of science, and of all those who believe that all human problems are fundamentally resolvable with the progress of science. See, either way, that's showing that the interpretations don't suffice. And I think a better reading of Hegel makes like for a fuller reading of Aristotle, that just like almost all the people who say they're Aristotelians and pick up the prior and run out with stuff like there is no void, still have it that Aristotle agrees and makes that yes, there's an actual absolute infinite, and yes, there's the counter arguments, and then Hegel does make, he's like, well, yeah, we do answer a fundamental question of metaphysics and make science real strong too, because he has to at least have something which will hold up, because the science is the intersubjective aspect of anything that he could ever hope to demonstrate that he couldn't just convince by their mental senses. And so that's something that that is so. That in this case, that scientism after Comte and up to Boole and logicist positivism and Husserl and the Carnap and Vienna Circle and this kind of thing, vis-a-vis Hegel, and then like as to Collingwood and Winston H. F. Barnes and these sorts of thinkers, and then up to today, here that, and then I just take both of those and say, they fit together, and it's going to be all right. You got to resolve all the paradoxes. There are none left. There are no mathematical or logical paradoxes left. It's fine. And then that, yes, we're about human creatures in our intersubjectivity and can only agree to kind of establish that is so. Yet anybody on their own account can, so you might as well, because it's true to them if they arrive at that. Then gets into the ideas. Then is here of as Gadamer is describing, it was like these schools were basically either side of the hall, but they are the philosophy department, and then the other half of the philosophy department is trying to use that to tell people what they want to hear. So this is the technical and technoanalytic side of that, and why A theory is so great. It's A theory and the theory. Thea theory. That was the new word I was going to say. Thea, Thea, theory, Thea theory. For this Heno theory, or Hano theory, Thea theory. So, reflecting on Hegel, reflecting on Gadamer, reflecting on Sartre, helps to bring us through the 20th century to the 21st century. And therefore something like Graham Priest and paraconsistent dialectic argument, there's at least somebody came along and says, hey, I can readily derive contradictions. They got to go together. Let's put logic together. For somebody like Dana Scott, who at least is like, well, yeah, I sat under Tarski and I know everything, but I also know these logical paradoxes and I put them together both ways, box and circle modality. Both, that, at least for sure in mathematical logic, there are ways to look at that. And then I come up at some point, it's like, here's my slates of uncountability resolved for the uncartesian, and for paradox resolved for the extraordinary, as after Mirimanoff and Skolem, who are just left off as ignored one way, and then for Skolem, just like independent, Erdős' giant monster of independence, for Cohen's independence of the continuum hypothesis after the Cantorian, that putting together the Cantorian and the Pythagorean has that the Cantorian has everything in the numbers is almost everywhere transcendental and unreachable, and the Pythagoreans have that basically nothing is, that it's all rational. And so it's a great schism and a chasm when people have naturally, according to learning, it's one way or the other, when for somebody else it's the other way. And so then even having a third way that's in the middle, that neither of these two sides that reach, they're even actually reaching themselves, because we proved after something like Hilbert's postulate of continuity and Leibniz's principle of perfection that the line is made of points, so the points making the line are beyond each other, yet so to be each other, the line drawing, the act of fate of Xenocrates. And for Zeno, then what I have is I just say, well, there's one straight down the middle too, and so it's one that's half and half, and that's unreachable from either side, yet it's made from just a deductive account. And then for various aspects of the laws of large numbers, and for Cantor, the inspection of the Cantor space, the space of all the sequences of zeros and ones, every distinct one, only exactly once a piece, and as I put them in order. And so that being non-contradictory itself and non-paradoxical itself is its own sort of superclassical reasoning that any may arrive at, and I suggest one does. Because otherwise I will find a way to make it wrong or be broken. Or people will make something like Russell's retro-thesis and then end up having to employ material implication, be wrong and easily fooled. So Aristotle won't be made a fool. Hegel gives grounds for reason under any circumstances. And then all the mathematics is in its constructive account. And where it needs to be, it's non-constructivist account, that meaning proofs by negation, for their intuitionism was like, well, I can't just say this is so. I got to say some reason why it's not so too. That it works out that thus the A theory is great. It's the theory, or it's abstractly the theory, and which is also good enough that this theory for theoria. Then also is about what is needed to make a proper logos, discursive logos of the 21st century. So let's see, then Gadamer might say a little bit more, but he does help explain like the controversy that goes on. Then he's talking about human being as the essence. Human being is an essence. He talks about vital instincts. His arete. Rather, it is to do with what is each individual's due as a citizen and what constitutes his arete or excellence. Practical philosophy. So the proesis and stuff like that, and the arete, and the propedeutic, and here poesis. These are aspects of interpersonal and sometimes international relations. But here it's about just the intersubjective and interobjective. Practical philosophy. So practical philosophy is the pragmatic, like for the explanatory factors or nosics, as it was put, and these kinds of things. That this is after talking about Hegel, because Hegel is just so great. And then this is like so. And then, see, here's a copy of the Bible. We read that here and point to it for fundamental question of metaphysics and the beginning in space and the beginning in words. This is Sadov on modern macroscopic theory of matter and fields, a thermodynamic approach. So this is modern mechanics and dynamics in a book. An Aristotle dictionary. That here's this Hegel's Wissenschaft der Logik. Let's see if I marked kind of where in the middle he says what I intend to read. Talks about the various forms of idealism, Leibnizian, Kantian, Fichtean, and others, have not advanced beyond being as determinateness, have not advanced beyond this immediacy, any more than skepticism did. Skepticism permits the contents of its illusory being to be given to it, where whatever content is supposed to have for skepticism, it is immediate. The monad of Leibniz evolves its ideas and representations out of itself, but is not the power that generates and binds them together. Rather, it arises the monad like bubbles. They are indifferent and immediate over against one another in the same relation to the monad itself. Similarly, the Kantian appearance is a given content of perception. It presupposes affections, determinations of the subject, which are immediate relatively to themselves, to the object. It may well be that the infinite obstacle that's probably a telling term, anstos, of Fichte's idealism has no underlying thing in itself, so that it becomes purely a determinateness in the ego. But for the ego, this determinateness, which is appropriates and whose externality it sublates, is at the same time immediate, a limitation of the ego, which can transcend, but which has in it an element of indifference. So it also, the limitation is in the ego, contains an immediate non-being of the ego. So here you can relate that to Sartre as the limitation, as the nothing, and as regards to the thing in itself, that here's this dually self-consistent. It's like, well, is it one or the other? It's like, yeah, it's one or the other. But either way, it's the same, is the idea that being null and the nothing fulfills under consideration whether it was just everything at once. And then also in the idea of the apple, that an apple in the universe is and only is everything that it is not. That in the context, the universal context, something is only defined by its classical being as the center of all the potentials at once. What the sum of potentials after sum of history theory, least gradient after least action, make for a real sort of theory and for the space of thought that then thusly Hegel can be realized as he notes these things which are missing, and the anstos of what is, or the infinite obstacle is, again, its own infinite impetus of a sort. The dunamis and dynamis. The relation is still imperfect union of reflection into otherness and reflection into self. The perfect interpenetration of both is actuality. So then this is for actuality and Husserl and geometry and stuff. That thusly Hegel, it has a lot going on with regards to axiomless natural deduction. So you could call Hegel's science of logic a study of axiomless natural deduction as well. Well, gentle readers, that's how I wanted to end this discussion of Logos 2000, 21st century foundations, with a theory being that thusly this philosophical development is having a name. It's a theory, and I've called it that for about 20, 25 years in some of my tens, thousands posts and essays to Usenet. And here as well, it's generally a usual thing. And it's so that's something like for all the video essays that have ever been on YouTube on this channel, that's always been sort of an implicit, and it can go without saying because it is an implicit, and yet as being explicit thusly, then it's also profound. The approfondissement is generally considered here actualized. Warm regards, then. I'll just look to continue reading some books that's from the book banter, putting that into the philosophical foreground, that then this will hopefully fit in one video, and I hope it's useful to you, and that you'll be able to refer to these same sources and make for your own developments, your own relations in these accounts, that it is possibly so that you will find the theory of everything. And that will be it. So long.